Before Latin America learned to fear the helicopter, it learned to fear the radio. A whisper in Guatemala became a coup. A beach in Cuba became a humiliation. A palace in Chile became smoke. And now, with Venezuela dragging that old ghost back into the light, one question returns like static in the dark. When did intelligence stop being about watching the world and start deciding who gets to rule it? Tonight, we follow the wire. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Laura, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime, to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. Before the boots, before the helicopters, before the steel door gives way, there's always a wire humming in the dark. January 3rd, 2026, Caracas before dawn, rotor wash, broken concrete, a ruler dragged out of the night by an operation, the public record described as a marriage of American force and CIA intelligence. The first report said Nicolas Maduro's routines had been mapped until his life became a timetable. And across Latin America, people heard something older than the blast. They heard the static. Now, let us be careful with that opening, because care is part of respect. The Venezuelan chapter is still too recent, too hot, too tangled to treat like a sealed archive. What we have is the public account reporting from the moment, not the mountain of declassified paper that exists for Guatemala or Chile. But even that was enough to wake an old continental instinct. One headline about a captured strongman, and the region remembered that in our history, intelligence has rarely stayed in the realm of listening. So to understand why the word CIA still lands in the chest like bad weather, we have to walk back to July 26, 1947. That was the day President Harry Truman signed the National Security Act, laying the foundation for the post-war American security state. The stated lesson came from Pearl Harbor, from the fear that scattered intelligence had left the country blind at the worst possible moment. Washington wanted one place to gather, compare, and deliver foreign intelligence before surprise could strike again. On paper, the mission sounded almost tidy. Collect intelligence, correlate it, evaluate it, put it in the president's hands. But tucked into that legal architecture was a more dangerous opening, the kind of sentence history later learns to fear. The agency could also perform other functions and duties tied to national security. That soft, vague language became a trap door. Once the Cold War hardened, it gave a room secret power not only to observe policy, but to become policy, with its face covered. That distinction matters. Intelligence collection is one thing. Every state listens. Covert action is something else entirely. That is when a government decides not merely to know another country, but to lean on it, shape it, weaken it, or rearrange it while pretending its hands are somewhere else. In Latin America, where Washington had long spoken of the hemisphere as if it were a fenced backyard, the new agency inherited old imperial habits and dressed them in modern security language. And let us kill another lazy myth while we are here. Our region was never a table full of helpless chess pieces waiting for foreigners to move them. Local elites mattered. Generals mattered. Landowners mattered. Newspaper owners mattered. Bishops, party bosses, businessmen, police chiefs, and frightened middle classes all made choices. The empire did not arrive here like a ghost. It worked by finding partners, feeding their fears, funding their desires, and blessing the violence they were already willing to imagine. Guatemala, 1954. If you want to see the model harden into a method, start there. Jacobo Arbenz had been elected through the ballot box, and he was not the cartoon puppet Washington sold to the world. He was a nationalist reformer seeking to bend one of the hemisphere's most unequal countries toward land redistribution and state sovereignty. That meant touching the power of the United Fruit Company, yes. Still, it also meant something deeper, proving that social change in Latin America might happen without asking Washington's permission. In the fevered Cold War imagination, that was enough to turn reform into infection. So the operation began, what Washington called Operation PB Success. And notice the style, because it will return like a curse. Not a giant conquering army, not some glorious invasion fleet. Something cheaper, leaner, more deceitful, aircraft overhead, selective bombings, diplomatic pressure, money is moving quietly, and most of all, radio, rumor, static. The battle was designed to unfold in people's minds before it reached the streets. Inside Guatemala City, uncertainty became its own artillery. Officers did not only ask who was winning, they asked who had already switched sides, who had already lost faith, who was already speaking with the other camp. The point was not necessarily to crush the Guatemalan military in open battle. The point was to convince it that resistance had become absurd, that the government was already collapsing, that the future had already chosen. Even assassination planning hovered in the shadows if events escalated further. Then the decisive moment arrived, quiet and terrible. The Guatemalan military refused to fully stand behind Arbenz, and once that spine buckled, The rest followed. On June 27th, 1954, he resigned. Carlos Castillo Armas, carried by the covert campaign, moved toward power through a doorway opened by fear, pressure, and psychological war more than by battlefield brilliance. From Langley in the White House, it could look clean, almost elegant, a cheap victory, a deniable victory, the kind of victory empires love to brag about in whispers. But the land keeps receipts. Guatemala did not become stable after Arbenz fell. It became wounded and open. Repression deepened. Security institutions hardened. The path was laid toward civil war, disappearances, scorched earth campaigns, and massacres that struck indigenous communities with especially savage force. What looked tactically clever from far away became, in human terms, one of the hemisphere's great disasters. That is the first lesson of this story. Covert success and historical success are not the same. One can bloom quickly, the other may never come. And Guatemala taught Washington something dangerous. It taught that covert action could be cheap, deniable, and effective in the short run. It taught that you could combine business fears, anti-communist doctrine, racial arrogance, and local elite panic into one neat operation and call it stability. It also taught a habit that would haunt the continent for decades. When Latin Americans tried to build their own path, even a reformist one, Washington often read independent development itself as a threat. Then came Cuba, and the whole hemisphere's temperature changed. Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959 turned the Caribbean into more than sea and sugar in memory. It became a mirror in which the United States could not see itself. A successful anti-imperial revolution sitting so close to Florida was not just a strategic problem, it was a symbolic one. It showed that defiance could survive in the very waters Washington had long treated as its own. So Cuba stopped being merely a country. It became an obsession. The plan that followed was so simple it almost sounds childish when said out loud. Train Cuban exiles, land them on the island, strike hard enough to trigger an uprising, watch Castro fall. Men were recruited, camps were built, weapons were prepared, and expectations were inflated until they no longer resembled reality. This is the great seduction of covert culture. Once enough powerful people repeat the fantasy in a closed room, the fantasy begins to wear the clothes of strategy. In April of 1961, Brigade 2506 landed at the Bay of Pigs. The uprising they expected never came. Castro's forces moved fast, in strength, and under direct command. The beachhead collapsed. Invaders were pinned down, overwhelmed, and captured in large numbers. It was not merely a failed military operation. It was a failure of political reading, of language, of humility. The planners had mistaken exile hope for island reality, and they paid for that confusion and humiliation broadcast to the whole world. And once again, the deeper consequence cut in the wrong direction. Instead of toppling Castro, the invasion strengthened him. It validated his anti-imperial narrative. It pushed Cuba further into Soviet embrace. It helped sharpen the crisis atmosphere that would soon terrify the planet. So there it was again, the old contradiction. An operation sold as protection ended up helping create the very danger it claimed to contain. In our region, that pattern recurs so often it feels like a ritual. After the Bay of Pigs, the obsession with Castro did not cool. It got stranger, uglier, more feverish. Senate investigations years later exposed a gallery of assassination plots, some grotesque, some absurd, some involving organized crime intermediaries. A poison device here, a contaminated diving suit there, an exploding seashell in the folklore of statecraft. People repeat these details because they sound ridiculous, and they are ridiculous. But beneath the dark comedy sits something serious, an intelligence service drifting from analysis into a theology of removal at any cost. That is why Cuba matters beyond the failed beach landing. It revealed an institutional mindset. Secrecy had started masquerading as wisdom, deniability had started masquerading as restraint, and covert action had begun to believe that local populations would rise on cue, that reality would bend to a plan simply because it had been blessed by powerful men. Cuba answered with a brutal no. The island would not perform the script written for it, and that refusal humiliated a superpower in front of the world. The Dominican Republic demonstrated a different kind of imperial flexibility. Rafael Trujillo had long been tolerated because anti-communist strongmen were often easier for Washington to stomach than unpredictable Democrats. But when Trujillo became too costly, too embarrassing, too unstable, the posture shifted. The record there is more tangled than the simpler legends allow. American officials encouraged dissidents, and weapons moved into the story. Still, the headquarters grew nervous and tried to halt what had already been set in motion. Even the machine guns requested for the plot were never passed along. That ambiguity is the point. Washington did not oppose dictatorship as a moral category. It opposed regimes that became inconvenient, unreliable, or dangerous to larger interests. The Dominican case is not the picture of a master puppeteer pulling a single string. It is messier than that, which is exactly why it is useful. It shows how covert politics often works in the real world: partial backing, partial retreat, local actors moving with their own agendas, and history spilling out of the container anyway. Now the camera climbs into the Bolivian mountains. Ernesto Che Guevara, after Cuba, tried to ignite continental revolution, to turn one insurgent spark into a hemispheric flame. Instead, he found isolation, weak support, poor communication, and a hunt closing in on him. Bolivian forces, trained and advised with American backing, tightened the circle. CIA-linked personnel provided intelligence and liaison support. On October 8th, 1967, Che was captured near La Higuera. Soon after, he was executed by Bolivian forces. The insurgency was crushed. The image was not. That split matters. Strategically, the operation looked effective. Symbolically, it manufactured a martyr. Che's face would outlive the men who hunted him. That is another lesson our region knows in its bones. An insurgent fighter can be killed and still win the poster. A government can be toppled and still win the memory. History does not only count bodies and borders. It counts myths, songs, symbols, and the strange afterlife of the defeated. Sometimes that afterlife is longer than the victory itself. Then we arrive in Chile, and the story grows colder, more bureaucratic, almost elegant in its cruelty. Salvador Allende was elected in 1970 through constitutional means. That fact made him especially threatening. He had not seized power with a rifle. He had walked in through the front door of democracy. A socialist project advancing through elections rather than insurrection could inspire the rest of the region. For Washington, that possibility was intolerable. If the model succeeded in Santiago, who else might dare to try it? So what followed was not one sudden stab in the dark, at least not at first. It was a campaign. Quiet money flowing to opposition channels. Hostile media strengthened. Economic pressure is intensifying. International credit is squeezed. Contacts with the military are explored. Nixon's famous line about making the economy scream was not just a phrase, it was a worldview. The idea was to tighten the air itself until democratic government felt like suffocation, until the electorate could be taught to associate social reform with chaos, hunger, paralysis, and dread. Now, notice the nuance, because bad storytelling usually lies right here. The strongest grounded reading is not that Washington choreographed every minute of the September 11th, 1973 coup like a film director calling camera angles. The exact operational line between encouragement and command remains contested in places. But the broader story is beyond serious doubt. The United States worked relentlessly to weaken Allende, isolate his government, and make democratic breakdown more likely. The road to the presidential palace did not begin with the jets. It began long before the engines screamed. Then the jets came anyway. Santiago is under attack, La Moneda burning, Allende inside, refusing surrender, speaking into history while the walls closed in. By the end of that day, General Augusto Pinochet was rising through the smoke toward dictatorship. And once again, the old justification arrived, wearing respectable clothes. This is unfortunate. This is necessary. This is better than the alternative. Latin America has buried too many people beneath that sentence to ever hear it as neutral again. Because Pinochet's Chile did not bring clean order. It brought detention centers, torture chambers, censorship, exile, disappearance, and an economy reordered under authoritarian rule. The prison and the stock market walked together. Families learned the cruelty of not knowing where a son had been taken or whether a daughter was still alive. And this is why Chile remains such a wound in the regional imagination. It was not merely the fall of one government, it was the suffocation of a democratic road that many believed had been possible. Now the story widens and darkens into a network. Operation Condor was not a neat caper with a single villain and a single ending. It was a system. In the middle of the 1970s, the dictatorships of the Southern Cone built a transnational machine to identify, track, kidnap, torture, and eliminate opponents across borders. Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, and later others. Exile stopped, meaning safety. Borders stopped, meaning refuge. The hunt learned to cross customs lines as if sovereignty itself were just another door to be forced open. The official language was almost obscene in its calm. The founding idea, gathered in Santiago in late 1975, was to create something like an anti-subversion Interpol. Listen to the bureaucratic chill of that. A collaborative system. Shared files, shared targets, shared operations, as if terror could be cleaned up simply by giving it stationery and a communications network. But that is how modern repression often speaks, not in wild speeches, but in memoranda, technical systems, budgets, liaison channels, and quiet agreements about who may be hunted where. And there, returning like a ghost from the opening, is our wire in the dark. Condor was not only ideology and murder, it was infrastructure. Records describe Condortel, the communications backbone that enables the member regimes to communicate quickly and secretly. Part of that nervous system ran through a United States communications installation in the Panama Canal Zone. Think about that image for a moment. Somewhere, a telex machine chatters. Somewhere else, a door is kicked in. Technology and terror are meeting in the same sentence. Passports, border stamps, unmarked cars, a name typed onto a list in one country and a body taken in another. That was the live shape of Condor. And here we must be exact. The Southern Cone regimes had their own agency, their own initiative, their own appetite for brutality. They did not need foreigners to invent cruelty for them, but the broader anti-communist architecture built by Washington, the training relationships, the intelligence ties, the tolerance, and at times the assistance helped create an atmosphere where this multinational repression could breathe. Then comes the detail that shatters any illusion that Condor was some distant South American nightmare with no reach beyond its own map. September 21st, 1976, Washington, D.C. A car bomb killed Orlando Letelier, a former Chilean diplomat and fierce critic of Pinochet, and also killed Ronnie Carpin Moffett. There it was, undeniable. The network had reached the capital of the very power that claimed to lead the free world. Embassy Row itself had become part of the Southern Cone's after-hours geography of murder. That bombing is one of those moments history should force people to sit with. Not because it proves every lurid claim ever made, but because it proves enough. The methods of regional state terror were not confined to some faraway jungle or prison basement hidden behind language barriers. They arrived in the Imperial Center with fire and shrapnel. A car in Washington became evidence that the machinery of disappearance and assassination had grown confident enough to operate in the heart of the hemisphere's most powerful state. And the diplomatic weather around Condor mattered too. In June of 1976, Henry Kissinger told Argentina's foreign minister, in words history has never quite forgiven, that if there were things that had to be done, they should be done quickly and then return to normal procedures. That sentence is not a smoking gun in the cartoon sense. It is something colder. It is the temperature of the empire when human rights are treated as a scheduling problem rather than a moral wall. If Guatemala was the prototype and Chile the chilling demonstration, Nicaragua became the sequel that spilled back into the United States itself. In July 1979, the Sandinista Revolution overthrew Anastasio Somoza. It ended a dynasty that Washington had long lived with. To the Reagan administration, this was not just a local revolution. It was a strategic alarm bell. Another leftist government in the region, another fear of Cuban and Soviet influence, another argument that secret war might do what public policy could not admit out loud. So the Contra campaign took shape. Supply drops at night, training camps in Honduras, airstrips hidden in the brush, harbors are seeded with mines, deniability on paper, escalation on the ground. And beneath the language of rollback and security, ordinary Nicaraguans paid the price. The Contras were accused of serious abuses against civilians. In the countryside, geopolitics translated into burned homes, fear on village roads, and families forced to read the sky for helicopters, as earlier generations had read the weather. The world noticed. Nicaragua took its case to the International Court of Justice, which ruled against the United States, finding that Washington had violated the principles against the use of force and non-intervention. A legal judgment does not stop a covert war by magic, but it did something important. It stripped the operation of some of its perfume. The language of freedom had to stand next to the language of unlawful force, and the pairing was not flattering. Then came the twist that turned regional history into a constitutional thriller. Congress tried to place limits on support for the Contras. The executive branch went looking for side doors. Secret funding channels appeared. Arms money and covert policy began weaving into the scandal that would explode as Iran-Contra. Suddenly, the issue was no longer only in Nicaragua. It was whether a democracy could tolerate a hidden foreign policy run around its own laws. Covert action abroad had crossed the border and entered the bloodstream of the state that waged it. That, too, is part of the Latin American lesson. Secret war does not stay where it is launched. It teaches habits. It teaches officials to romanticize secrecy, to treat oversight as an annoyance, to confuse boldness with impunity. The same shadow culture that helped wreck institutions in our region also exposed fragility inside the United States itself. One foreign policy for speeches, another for shadows. One for Congress, another for the back channel. The scandal made visible what Latin America had been living with for decades. Look back across the cases, and the pattern is almost indecent in its consistency. Guatemala, a quick overthrow. then decades of blood. Cuba, a failed invasion that strengthened the revolution it meant to kill. Bolivia, an insurgent eliminated then immortalized. Chile, democracy suffocated before the tanks finished rolling. Condor, borders turned into hunting corridors. Nicaragua, a secret war that became a public scandal. Even when the immediate objective was achieved, the longer moral invoice arrived later, heavier, and usually paid by people far from the meeting room. And we should say clearly who those people were: peasants, workers, students, journalists, teachers, priests, union organizers, mothers with missing sons, children old enough to memorize the sound of a military truck but too young to understand the ideology painted on its side. This is what disappears when history is told only as strategy. The archive may be built from cables and memoranda, but the truth underneath it lives in empty chairs, unmarked graves, and families who learned to keep one lamp on. Truman himself later sounded uneasy about what the agency had become. He suggested he had intended a coordinating intelligence body, not a covert policy arm running peacetime cloak and dagger operations worldwide. Whether that regret was pure conscience, partial self-protection, or some mix of both, the warning still matters. Institutions created in the name of security do not remain modest just because their founders once used cautious language. Power is a vine. Give it one wall and it will start looking for the roof. And that brings us back to Venezuela, because the recent chapter only lands with full force when heard against this background hum. The public account of January 3rd, 2026 described an operation built on months of intelligence work, including the mapping of Maduro's daily routines and the help of a source close to him. That is the reported story. The fuller archive does not exist yet in public view. We are still close enough to the blast that smoke remains in the record. That caution matters, but so does another one. Not every target of Washington becomes noble just because Washington moves against him. Maduro's government had been widely condemned as authoritarian, corrupt, and repressive. At the same time, millions of Venezuelans endured economic collapse, shortages, exile, and political suffocation. A serious telling does not romanticize that suffering. Latin America knows too much about strongmen to turn every enemy of the empire into a saint. Respect for truth means refusing both imperial amnesia and lazy anti-American mythology. Still, even the suspicion of covert American action in Venezuela was enough to shake the whole historical shelf. Why? Because the region remembers. Because Guatemala, Cuba, Chile, and Nicaragua taught generations to hear intelligence not as a neutral instrument, but as a possible prelude. The fear is not abstract. It has lineage. And that lineage matters politically. It can strengthen regime propaganda, frighten neighboring governments, and even delegitimize local democratic opposition by making domestic dissent seem like the front porch of foreign intervention. That does not mean every use of intelligence abroad belongs in the same bag. Gathering information on transnational criminal networks is not the same as organizing a coup. Supporting sanctions enforcement is not the same as building an exile brigade. Monitoring an authoritarian government is not the same as deciding a nation's fate from the shadows. Precision matters. Otherwise, history turns into a slogan. But once a state has built a long record of covert manipulation, even its narrower actions will be interpreted through that older, darker memory. And maybe that is the most important question in this whole story. Not whether the United States always faced easy choices. It did not. The 20th century was full of hard ones. The question is where intelligence ends and secret rule begins. Where informing policy becomes making policy in disguise. Where a democracy that says it defends sovereignty begins deciding which sovereignties are negotiable. Latin America has lived inside that question for generations, and too often the answer arrived first as static, then as fire. Recent scholarship has widened the frame beyond the old movie version of spies and trench coats. This history is not only about covert action in the narrow sense, it is about empire, capitalism, decolonization, anti-communism, counterinsurgency doctrine, and the belief that Latin America was a place where social experiments could be interrupted for the sake of someone else's strategic comfort. Seen that way, the CIA was not some accident floating outside policy. It became one of the sharpest instruments of post-war American power. There is also an archival lesson here, and it matters more than people think. For years, plausible deniability was not just a diplomatic shield, it was a weapon against memory itself. Official narratives were incomplete, evasive, or flatly false. What we know now has come from declassified memoranda, congressional investigations, court records, oral histories, and the stubborn work of comparing Washington's paperwork with Latin American testimony. In other words, truth did not simply emerge, it was excavated. Like pottery from a field someone hoped would stay buried. So the final paradox is this. The agency was founded to protect national security by helping the United States see danger clearly. Yet in Latin America, some of its most famous actions did not merely identify instability, they helped manufacture it. Governments were weakened or toppled, armed factions were supported, repression was normalized, secrecy displaced accountability, and then, when the wreckage appeared, that wreckage could be cited as proof that the region was unstable and needed further management. History has a bitter sense of irony, which is why the real story of the CIA in Latin America was never just spies in raincoats. It was radio stations, exile brigades, rumor campaigns, economic pressure, front groups, liaison officers, military briefings, black budgets, encrypted messages, safe houses, and the patient cultivation of men with guns. Sometimes Washington called it defense, sometimes it is called an order, sometimes it denied everything. But archive after archive, testimony after testimony, the pattern returns. Interventions that promised stability often delivered a longer season of ruin. And so we end where we began, with the wire humming in the dark. January 3rd, 2026, Caracas. Before dawn, a captured ruler. A public account still fresh and contested. Behind that moment stands a longer corridor of echoes. Guatemala under radio static, Cuba under failed invasion, Chile under jets, Condor under telex chatter, Nicaragua under mined harbors and secret funding. Different countries, different circumstances, different targets, but the same dangerous temptation is always nearby, to call domination security if it happens quietly enough. That may be why this history refuses to die. Because in our part of the world, memory is not decoration. It is a form of self-defense. We remember not to romanticize every fallen leader, not to flatten every country into victimhood, and not to excuse secret power just because it speaks in the language of order. We remember because once the static begins, it is often already late. And we remember because the dead, even in silence, keep insisting that someone say how the wire was laid. So tell me this, when you hear the long story, which chapter feels like the deepest scar in Latin America's memory? Guatemala, Cuba, Chile, Condor, Nicaragua, or the recent Venezuelan episode? And what single image from that chapter stays under your skin? Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.